My name is Garrett. I've lived in this quiet suburban neighborhood for almost 15 years now, the last 3 of them alone. When Rebecca died, everyone told me I should sell the house, that it would be too full of memories to bear. But I couldn't leave. This was where we'd planned to grow old together, where every corner held some echo of her laugh, where the garden still bloomed with the perennials she'd so carefully planted. Leaving felt like losing her all over again. So I stayed, settling into a routine that was bearable, if not happy. At 52, I taught history at the local community college, came home to an empty house, graded papers in the evenings, and tried not to notice the silence that had replaced Rebecca's voice. The neighbors were kind but respectful of my grief, offering help when needed, but otherwise letting me be. I appreciated their distance as much as their concern. That Tuesday in October began like any other. I returned from campus just before sunset, arms laden with groceries and a stack of midterm essays that would consume my weekend. The air had the crisp smell of autumn, leaves crunching beneath my feet as I walked up the path to my front door. That's when I noticed the package. It was a large cardboard box, about the size of a microwave, sitting squarely on my welcome mat. I hadn't ordered anything, but that wasn't unusual. Rebecca had been an enthusiastic online shopper, and occasionally packages still arrived for her, automated renewals of things I hadn't had the heart to cancel. Each one was a small, unexpected reminder of her absence. I set down my groceries and briefcase, fishing my keys from my pocket with one hand while examining the label. The box wasn't addressed to Rebecca or to me. The recipient was Miles Anderson, and the address was 1487 Maple Street. My address was 1481. The delivery person had made a simple mistake, dropping the package off 6 houses too early. I could have just carried it down to 1487 right then, but the stack of essays was calling my name, and dinner needed to be prepared. Tomorrow would be soon enough to play delivery man. I brought everything inside, including the misdirected package, which I set by the door so I wouldn't forget. The next day was a blur of lectures and faculty meetings, and I didn't make it home until well after dark. The package still waited by the door, a silent reminder of an errand not yet run. Too late to knock on a neighbor's door now, I decided. It would have to wait until the weekend. But Saturday morning, as I was enjoying my coffee on the front porch, a habit I'd maintained despite the emptiness of the second chair, my conscience got the better of me. The package had been sitting in my entry for 3 days now. What if it contained something important? Medication, perhaps, or time-sensitive documents? I carried my coffee mug back inside, rinsed it in the sink, and picked up the box. It was surprisingly heavy, with a return address from an online bookstore. Well, at least it wasn't medication. Still, I should have delivered it sooner. Number 1487 was a well-maintained Tudor-style house near the end of the street. I'd passed it on my evening walks, but had never paid much attention to who lived there. Our neighborhood had changed significantly in the 15 years since Rebecca and I had moved in. Young families had replaced older residents, and I'd lost track of who was where in the shuffle of my grief. I rang the doorbell and waited, the weight of the box growing heavier in my arms. After a moment, I heard footsteps, and then the door swung open. The man who stood there was probably in his early 40s, with dark hair just beginning to silver at the temples and eyes the color of weathered blue jeans. He was dressed casually in a faded t-shirt and jeans, feet bare, as if he'd been lounging around the house. Something about his expression, a mixture of surprise and what looked almost like wariness, gave me the impression he wasn't accustomed to unexpected visitors. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice pleasant despite the cautious look. I shifted the box in my arms. "Miles Anderson?" He nodded. "I'm Garrett Phillips, from down the street. This was delivered to my house by mistake." I extended the package toward him. I should have brought it over sooner, but work got in the way. I hope it wasn't anything urgent. His expression relaxed into something more open, perhaps even relieved. "Oh, no, nothing urgent. Just some books I ordered." He accepted the box, setting it down just inside the door. "Thank you for bringing it over. Most people would have just sent it back." "No trouble," I assured him, already taking a step back, ready to retreat to the solitude of my own home. But Miles didn't immediately close the door. "Would you like some coffee?" he offered unexpectedly. "I just made a fresh pot. Least I can do to thank you for the delivery." The invitation caught me off guard. My instinct was to politely decline, as I had declined most social overtures since Rebecca's passing. But something in his eyes, a flicker of what might have been hope, made me hesitate. That's kind of you, I said, surprising myself. Coffee would be nice. He smiled then, a genuine expression that transformed his face, erasing the wariness I'd noticed earlier. Great. Come on in. Excuse the mess. I wasn't expecting company. I followed him into a living room that hardly qualified as messy by any reasonable standard. There were a few books stacked on the coffee table, a half-empty mug beside them, a throw blanket draped haphazardly over the arm of the sofa. Signs of life, rather than disorder. The space was tastefully furnished in warm neutrals with splashes of deep blue and forest green, walls lined with bookshelves that appeared to be organized by some personal system rather than traditional categorization. Nice place, I commented, following him toward what I assumed was the kitchen. Thanks. I've been here about a year, but I'm still settling in some ways. He gestured for me to take a seat at a small kitchen table while he reached for mugs from a cabinet. How do you take your coffee? Black is fine. He poured 2 mugs, handed one to me, and took the seat opposite. For a moment, we sat in what should have been awkward silence, but somehow wasn't. There was something comfortable about Miles's presence, a lack of expectation that put me at ease. So, he said finally, you're at 1481? The house with the amazing flower garden. I nodded, a small pang of nostalgia hitting me at the mention of Rebecca's pride and joy. That's me, though I can't take credit for the garden. That was my wife's domain. I just try to keep it alive. Well, you're doing a good job. Those dahlias are spectacular. He took a sip of his coffee. Have you lived there long? About 15 years. You said you've been here a year? He nodded. Moved in last September. Needed a fresh start. Something in his tone suggested a story behind those words, but he didn't elaborate. The neighborhood's a good place for that, I offered. Quiet, friendly without being intrusive. That's exactly what I was looking for. He smiled again, but this time it didn't quite reach his eyes. Intrusive is what I was trying to get away from. I recognized the expression that flickered across his face, the carefully constructed mask of someone carrying a weight they didn't want to discuss. I'd seen it in my own mirror often enough. I understand the appeal of privacy, I said simply. Miles studied me for a moment, as if making a decision. Then he glanced at the package I'd delivered, sitting on the counter where he'd placed it. Would you like to know what's in the box? The question seemed odd, but I nodded, curious despite myself. He rose, retrieved a pair of scissors from a drawer, and sliced through the packing tape. It's research, actually, for a project I've been working on. From the box, he pulled several books, displaying their covers to me one by one. They were all related to rebuilding after trauma. Memoirs of survivors, psychological texts on resilience, practical guides to starting over. I'm a therapist, he explained, seeing my puzzled expression, specializing in trauma and grief counseling. I'm developing a new approach for my practice, focusing on recovery through creative expression. That sounds valuable, I said, impressed despite the twinge I felt at the mention of grief. Important work. It is. He hesitated, then added, it's also personal. I know what it's like to need rebuilding. He stacked the books carefully, his movements deliberate. My husband and I separated last year, after 12 years together. The revelation hung in the air between us, both the fact of his marriage and its dissolution. I felt a surprising stir of empathy, recognizing the particular pain of losing a partnership you'd thought would last forever, though our circumstances were different. I'm sorry, I said, meaning it. That must have been difficult. He let out a short, humorless laugh. That's one word for it. Devastating would be another. He returned to his seat, cradling his coffee mug between his hands. Ryan, that's my ex. He decided our life together was too conventional. Said he felt suffocated by domesticity. Wanted to explore other options. The bitterness in his voice was raw, still fresh despite the passage of a year. I recognized that too. How grief doesn't follow a tidy timeline. How it surges unexpectedly just when you think you've gained some control over it. The irony, Miles continued, is that we moved here for him. He wanted the suburban lifestyle, the house with the yard, the whole picture-perfect setup, then decided it was a prison instead of a dream. He shook his head. Sorry, I don't usually unload on strangers, especially ones just doing a neighborly favor. It's all right, I assured him. Sometimes it's easier to talk to someone who doesn't have any connection to the situation. He looked at me then, really looked. as if seeing me clearly for the first time. You mentioned your wife. The gardener. Is she? Cancer, I said, the word still difficult to speak aloud even after 3 years. 3 years ago. Understanding softened his features. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you. I took a sip of my coffee, now cooling in the mug. It's different from what you're going through, but I understand the loneliness. The adjustment to a life you didn't choose. Miles nodded, a flash of gratitude in his eyes at being understood without having to explain further. How long were you together? 24 years. We met in college. That's beautiful, he said softly. To have had that time together. It was. I smiled, finding it easier than usual to recall the good without being overwhelmed by the loss. Rebecca was extraordinary. Brilliant, funny, could grow anything. Our joke was that I taught history while she made things grow, both looking at life from opposite directions. She sounds wonderful. She was. I set down my mug. What about you? What brought you and Ryan together initially? Miles's expression warmed with the memory. We met at a conference. I was presenting a workshop on trauma-informed care. He was there representing a pharmaceutical company. He asked the most insightful questions. We ended up talking until the venue kicked us out. He shook his head. 12 years from that night, to, I can't do this anymore. Sometimes I still can't believe it. Grief has many forms, I observed. What you're experiencing is a kind of death too. The death of a future you thought was certain. He looked surprised, then appreciative. That's exactly it. I'm supposed to be the therapist, but you just articulated what I've been feeling better than I could. History professor. I reminded him with a small smile. Perspective on human experience is part of the job description. For the first time since I'd entered his home, Miles laughed. A genuine sound that transformed his face, erasing years of worry. Well, Professor, your perspective is refreshing and surprisingly comforting. Our conversation continued, moving from our losses to more general topics. Books we'd read recently. We discovered a shared appreciation for historical fiction, the changing character of the neighborhood, the merits of different coffee roasts. Before I realized it, an hour had passed, and I found myself more engaged than I had been in any social interaction since Rebecca's death. When I finally stood to leave, there was a moment of mutual recognition, an acknowledgement that something unexpected had transpired between two strangers united by different forms of loneliness. Thank you for the coffee, I said at his door. And the conversation. Thank you for delivering my package, he replied. Then, with a hint of uncertainty, maybe we could do this again sometime? I'll make a decent dinner, too, not just coffee. The invitation was casual, but held a note of genuine hope that resonated with something in me, a desire for connection I had been denying for too long. I'd like that, I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. How about next Friday? Around 7. 7 works. As I walked back to my house, I felt a lightness that had been absent for a long time. The interaction with Miles had awakened something I'd allowed to go dormant. The simple pleasure of human connection, of being seen and understood. The week passed with unusual anticipation. I found myself thinking about our conversation at odd moments, while lecturing about the Civil War, grading papers, or deadheading the last of Rebecca's autumn roses. There was a peculiar comfort in knowing I wasn't the only one navigating loneliness on our street, and having found someone who understood the particular challenges of rebuilding a life that had unexpectedly collapsed. Friday evening, I stood before my closet longer than usual, deliberating over what to wear. The last time I'd given any thought to my appearance for a social engagement had been before Rebecca's diagnosis. Eventually, I settled on a blue button-down shirt she had always liked and a pair of dark jeans that weren't frayed at the cuffs. I arrived at Miles's house precisely at 7, a bottle of decent red wine in hand. When he opened the door, I was struck again by how his smile transformed his face, erasing the guarded expression I'd first encountered. Right on time, he said, stepping back to let me in. I appreciate punctuality in a dinner guest. The house smelled amazing. Garlic, herbs, something rich and savory that made my stomach rumble in anticipation. I realized I had been subsisting on sandwiches and microwave meals for so long that I'd forgotten what a proper home-cooked dinner smelled like. I hope you like Italian, Miles said, leading me toward the kitchen, which now glowed with warm light from several strategically placed lamps. I make a lasagna that was my grandmother's recipe, one of the few things I can cook that actually impresses people. It smells incredible, I assured him, handing over the wine. This should pair well, I think. Though I'm no expert. He examined the label with appreciation. Perfect, actually. Thank you. The kitchen had been transformed since my last visit. The small table was now set with proper place settings, a candle burning at its center, cloth napkins folded beside white plates. It wasn't elaborate, but it showed care and attention to detail that touched me unexpectedly. Can I help with anything? I offered. Everything's under control. The lasagna needs about 5 more minutes, and the salad's ready. Why don't you open that wine and pour us each a glass? I found the corkscrew where he indicated and worked on opening the bottle while Miles checked something in the oven. There was an easy domesticity to the moment that should have felt strange, two virtual strangers moving around a kitchen together, but somehow didn't. Over dinner, our conversation flowed as naturally as it had during our first meeting. Miles told me more about his work as a therapist, his specialization in helping people process trauma, and his plans to incorporate more creative approaches into his practice. People think trauma recovery is just about talking, he explained, gesturing with his fork. But the body holds trauma too. Sometimes painting, or movement, or writing can access what words in a traditional therapy session can't reach. That makes sense, I said, thinking of how I'd thrown myself into tending Rebecca's garden after her death, finding solace in the physical labor of digging, planting, weeding. After my wife died, I kept her garden alive. It wasn't a conscious decision at first, just something I did because it needed doing. But it became a kind of therapy, I suppose. Miles nodded, understanding in his eyes. Exactly. You found your own path to processing grief. I'm just trying to help others discover theirs. I told him about my teaching, about how connecting young people with history had kept me anchored when everything else felt adrift. There's something powerful about placing your own experience in the context of human history, I explained. Realizing that people have endured unimaginable losses and still found ways to continue, to build something meaningful from what remains. That's beautiful, Garrett, Miles said softly. And profound. I might steal that perspective from my patients, if you don't mind. Consider it Creative Commons, I replied with a smile. By the time we finished the lasagna, which was indeed exceptional, and moved on to the tiramisu Miles had prepared for dessert, I felt more relaxed and engaged than I had in years. There was something about Miles's presence that invited openness without demanding it, that made conversation feel natural rather than obligatory. After dinner, we moved to his living room with the remainder of the wine. Miles put on some soft jazz, Miles Davis, appropriately enough, and we continued talking, the conversation shifting to books, music, films we'd enjoyed or found overrated. I haven't been to a movie theater since Rebecca died, I admitted at one point. We used to go every Saturday afternoon. Even the bad ones became good because we'd dissect them over dinner afterward. Instead of offering sympathy, Miles asked, "What was the last film you saw together?" The question caught me off guard. Most people avoided asking for specific memories, afraid they would trigger grief. But Miles seemed to understand intuitively that remembering could be a gift rather than just a source of pain. It was a science fiction film, actually. Not our usual genre, but the reviews were good. It was about time travel and family connections across generations. I smiled at the memory. Rebecca loved it. Said it was like history and future all mixed together, something for both of us. That sounds like a good final movie, Miles observed. A shared experience that represented both of you. I hadn't thought of it that way, I said, surprised by the insight. But you're right. It was fitting, somehow. As the evening stretched on, I found myself reluctant to leave. There was a comfort in Miles's company that I hadn't experienced in a long time. The ease of being with someone who understood loss without being defined by it. When I finally stood to go, it was well past 11, far later than I had planned to stay. Thank you for dinner, I said. It was the best meal I've had in years. And the company was even better. Miles smiled, that transformative expression that seemed to light him from within. I enjoyed it too. More than I expected to, honestly. It's been a while since I've had anyone over. At the door, there was a moment of awkwardness, the uncertainty of how to end an evening that had felt significant in ways neither of us had anticipated. Finally, Miles extended his hand. We should do this again, he said as we shook. Maybe next time you can show me that garden you've been maintaining. I'd like that, I replied, meaning it deeply. How about next Friday? I'm not much of a cook, but I can manage to grill a decent steak. It's a date, Miles said, then immediately looked embarrassed. I mean a plan. An arrangement. I knew what you meant, I assured him, strangely touched by his flustered response. Friday it is. Walking home under a clear night sky, I felt something stirring in my chest that I hadn't experienced in a long time. A sense of anticipation, of looking forward rather than merely getting through each day. It was disconcerting, but not unwelcome. The week that followed took on a different quality than the weeks, months, and years that had preceded it. I found myself thinking of things to share with Miles, an interesting passage from a book I was reading, a historical anecdote that connected to something he'd mentioned about his work, ideas for the garden now that autumn was deepening toward winter. The routine that had sustained me in my grief suddenly felt less like survival and more like preparation, each day bringing me closer to Friday, to another evening of conversation and connection. I also found myself paying more attention to my home, seeing it through the eyes of a visitor rather than someone merely inhabiting a space filled with memories. I cleaned more thoroughly than usual, arranged a few fresh flowers from the garden in a vase Rebecca had loved, and even replaced the burned-out bulb in the porch light that I'd been ignoring for months. Friday arrived with unusual anticipation. I left campus earlier than normal, stopped at the butcher shop for prime steaks, and spent more time than necessary deciding which wine would best complement the meal. By the time 7 o'clock approached, the steaks were marinating, the potatoes were ready for roasting, and I had changed my shirt twice. Miles arrived precisely on time, a bottle of wine in one hand and a small potted plant in the other. Housewarming gift, he explained, handing me the plant. Well, not exactly housewarming since you've been here 15 years, but I thought your garden might appreciate a new addition. It was a small Japanese maple. Its delicate leaves a deep burgundy that would complement the autumn flowers still blooming in Rebecca's garden. The thoughtfulness of the gesture, remembering our conversation about the garden, choosing something that would integrate with what was already there, touched me deeply. It's perfect, I said, genuinely moved. Thank you. I know exactly where it should go. I gave him a tour of the house, strangely nervous as we moved through rooms that reflected 15 years of life with Rebecca. Her presence was everywhere, in the books on the shelves, the artwork on the walls, the photographs I hadn't been able to put away despite the pain they sometimes caused. Miles noticed a framed photo on the mantel, Rebecca and me on a beach, laughing into the camera, her red hair blowing across her face in the wind. Is this her? He asked gently. I nodded. Taken about a year before her diagnosis. We were in Maine, celebrating our 20th anniversary. He studied the image. She had a beautiful smile. You look very happy together. We were, I said, and was surprised to find that the acknowledgement brought warmth rather than just pain. Even at the end, when things were hardest, we had moments of real joy. She never lost her ability to find humor in the darkest places. That's a rare gift, Miles observed. To maintain joy in the face of mortality. It was her greatest strength, I agreed, and the quality I miss most. As we moved through the house, I found myself sharing stories about Rebecca that I hadn't voiced aloud in years. How she'd insisted on painting the kitchen yellow despite the contractor's objections. Her habit of reading the last page of a novel first. The time she tried to rescue a baby bird that had fallen from its nest and ended up with scratches all over her arms, but a successful repatriation. Miles listened with genuine interest, asking questions that invited more memories rather than shutting them down. By the time we reached the back door that led to the garden, I realized I'd been talking about Rebecca more in 1 hour than I had in the past year combined. I'm sorry, I said as we stepped onto the back patio. I didn't mean to ramble on about the past. Miles shook his head. Don't apologize. It's beautiful to hear you talk about her. She sounds like someone who should be remembered out loud, not just in your thoughts. The insight struck me powerfully. I had been keeping Rebecca alive in my mind, but had stopped speaking of her to others, afraid of making them uncomfortable or of exposing my ongoing grief. But there was something healing in sharing her with someone who genuinely wanted to know her through my memories. The garden was past its summer glory but still beautiful in the early evening light. Autumn flowers bloomed in rich purples and golds, and the trees were just beginning to show their fall colors. I showed Miles the various sections, the perennial beds Rebecca had designed, the small vegetable garden we'd maintained together, the rose bushes that had been her particular pride. You've done an amazing job maintaining it, Miles said, genuine admiration in his voice. It feels loved. It is, I said simply. It's the most tangible piece of her I have left. As darkness fell, we moved back inside. I grilled the steaks while Miles prepared the salad I'd started earlier, working together in the kitchen with an ease that felt surprisingly natural. We ate at the dining table, a space I rarely used anymore, preferring to take my solitary meals at the kitchen counter, and continued our conversation from the previous week, picking up threads as if no time had passed between. After dinner, I showed Miles my study, where bookshelves lined the walls and papers from my current research project were spread across the desk. I'm working on a book, I explained, somewhat embarrassed by the admission, about everyday resistance during the Civil War. Ordinary people who found small ways to subvert authority, maintain their humanity in inhumane circumstances. That sounds fascinating, Miles said, examining the notes and photocopied documents with genuine interest. How long have you been working on it? Off and on for years. More seriously since Rebecca died. It gives me something to focus on besides teaching, and I gestured vaguely, encompassing the empty house, the absence at its center. The void, Miles supplied quietly. I understand. After Ryan left, I threw myself into research for new therapeutic approaches. Work is a socially acceptable form of distraction from grief. Exactly. I was struck again by how easily he understood, how his own experience of loss, though different from mine, created a bridge of comprehension between us. We ended up in the living room, nursing glasses of whiskey, the conversation flowing effortlessly from academic interests to more personal reflections. Miles told me more about his marriage to Ryan, how they'd built a life together, their dreams of eventually adopting children, the gradual disintegration as Ryan became increasingly restless and dissatisfied. The worst part, he confessed, was realizing that while I was planning our future, he was already mentally checking out. There were signs I ignored because I didn't want to see them. Classic therapist mistake, thinking I could fix something that was already broken beyond repair. That's not fair to yourself, I objected. Love requires a certain amount of faith, of belief in possibility. Without that, it collapses under the weight of doubt. Miles looked at me with something like wonder. How is it that you can articulate exactly what I need to hear? I spend all day helping others process their emotions, but you seem to understand mine without effort. The comment created a warmth in my chest that spread outward, a feeling of connection I had almost forgotten was possible. Perhaps it's easier to see clearly from outside the situation, I suggested. Or perhaps we just speak the same language of loss, despite the different dialects. He smiled at that, a soft expression that transformed his face in the warm lamplight. I like that. Different dialects of the same language. As the evening grew late, I found myself reluctant for it to end, just as I had been at Miles's house the week before. There was a comfort in his presence that I hadn't experienced in years, a sense of being truly seen and understood without judgment or expectation. When he finally stood to leave, close to midnight, I walked him to the door with a strange mixture of contentment and anticipation. Thank you for coming, I said, and for listening to all those stories about Rebecca. It felt good to speak of her aloud. Thank you for sharing her with me, he replied. And for dinner, next Friday at my place again. I'd like that. There was a moment of hesitation at the threshold, a beat of silence filled with unspoken possibility. Then Miles stepped forward and embraced me briefly, a warm, firm hug that ended before I could fully process it. Good night, Garrett, he said, already moving toward the porch steps. Good night, I replied, watching him walk down the path to the sidewalk, a curious lightness expanding in my chest. The following weeks established a pattern. Each Friday, we alternated between our homes, sharing meals and increasingly personal conversations. Miles taught me to make his grandmother's lasagna. I showed him how to properly deadhead roses to encourage late blooms. We discovered shared tastes in literature and film, debated historical interpretations of key events, and gradually revealed more of our histories to each other. I learned about Miles's childhood in Minnesota, his close relationship with his parents, who had been initially surprised but ultimately supportive when he came out in college, his passion for helping others process trauma, which had roots in his own experience of bullying as a teenager. He learned about my upbringing in a small Virginia town, my early fascination with history sparked by an eccentric high school teacher, My courtship of Rebecca during our undergraduate years. As autumn deepened into winter, our Friday dinners expanded to include occasional weekend activities. A visit to a historical exhibition I'd mentioned was interested in, a concert by a jazz quartet Miles had tickets for, a hike in the nearby state park where the fall foliage was at its peak. Each shared experience seemed to strengthen the connection between us, building a friendship that had begun with a misdelivered package and was growing into something I hadn't expected to find again at this stage of my life. It was during one of these outings, a crisp December afternoon spent at a small art museum featuring an exhibition on creative expressions of grief across cultures, that something shifted between us. We had been studying a series of Japanese paintings that depicted the changing seasons as metaphors for human emotional states when Miles said quietly, "I've been thinking about what you said that first night at my house. About grief taking many forms." I turned to him, curious. "What about it?" "You were right. But I think healing takes many forms too." He gestured toward the artwork. "Like these, different expressions of the same fundamental human experience." "That's a hopeful perspective," I observed. He nodded, his gaze still on the delicate brushstrokes depicting winter giving way to early spring. "I've felt more hopeful lately than I have in a long time. Since Ryan left." He glanced at me, something vulnerable in his expression. "I think a lot of that is because of you." The simple admission created a flutter in my chest, part surprise, part recognition of a truth I had been gradually acknowledging to myself. "I felt it too," I said carefully. "A kind of reawakening. I had resigned myself to a certain kind of half-life after Rebecca died. But these past months, spending time with you, I've remembered what it feels like to look forward rather than just looking back." Miles's smile then was like sunshine breaking through clouds, radiant with relief and something that might have been joy. I wasn't sure if you felt it too, or if I was projecting my own feelings onto our friendship. "What exactly are those feelings?" I asked, suddenly needing clarity, despite the public setting of our conversation. He hesitated, glancing around at the other museum patrons, then back to me. "Complicated ones. More than friendship, though that's at the foundation. Attraction, connection, possibility." He took a breath. "I understand if that's not where you are, or if it's not something you've considered. I know your history is different from mine." The question implicit in his words hung between us. I had never been attracted to a man before Miles. My romantic history consisted solely of Rebecca and a few girlfriends before her. Yet I couldn't deny the warmth that spread through me when Miles smiled, the anticipation I felt before our meetings, the sense of rightness I experienced in his company. "I haven't considered it explicitly," I admitted, "but I felt something growing between us. Something I wasn't looking for but can't ignore." I smiled ruefully. At my age, I thought that part of life was over. After losing Rebecca, I didn't expect to feel this kind of connection with anyone again, regardless of gender. Relief softened his features. "So I haven't completely misread the situation?" "No," I assured him. "You haven't. But I'm not sure what comes next. This is uncharted territory for me." "We don't have to map it all out immediately," Miles said gently. "We can take our time, see where this leads naturally. No pressure, no expectations." The understanding in his eyes, the absence of demand or presumption, confirmed what I already knew, that whatever was developing between us was built on mutual respect and genuine care, not just attraction or loneliness. "I'd like that," I said, feeling a weight lift that I hadn't realized I'd been carrying, the burden of uncertainty about the nature of our connection. We continued through the exhibition, but something had changed, a current of acknowledged possibility that charged the air between us. When Miles's hand brushed mine as we stood before a particularly moving sculpture, I didn't pull away. Instead, I let our fingers intertwine briefly, a silent acknowledgement of this new dimension to our relationship. The weeks that followed brought a gradual evolution. Our Friday dinners continued, but now included moments of more deliberate physical contact. A hand on a shoulder while looking at a book together, sitting closer on the couch during after-dinner conversations, lingering embraces when saying goodnight. Each small step felt significant but natural, like the slow changing of seasons rather than a sudden leap. As Christmas approached, Miles invited me to accompany him to his parents' home in Minnesota for the holiday. "They've been asking to meet you," he explained over dinner at my house. "I've mentioned you in our calls. Perhaps too often, according to my mother." The invitation touched me deeply. Are you sure? Holidays with family can be complicated enough without bringing someone new into the mix. I'm sure, he said firmly, but only if you're comfortable with it. I understand if it's too much, too soon. I considered the alternative, another Christmas alone in the house where Rebecca and I had celebrated so many holidays together. The thought held little appeal. I'd like to meet your family, I said, if you're ready for that step. His smile was worth any potential awkwardness the visit might entail. I am. More than ready. The trip to Minnesota was a turning point. Miles's parents, Martin and Elaine, welcomed me with a warmth that spoke of their son's happiness more than any words could have. Their home was festive and comfortable, filled with holiday decorations and family photographs that included many of Miles and Ryan together, a testament to their acceptance of their son's life in its entirety. We were heartbroken when things ended with Ryan. Elaine confided to me one evening while Miles and his father were engaged in their traditional Christmas Eve chess match. Not because we particularly liked him, though he was charming enough, but because Miles was so devastated. He's always been our sensitive one, feels things deeply. She patted my hand. It's good to see him smiling again. You've been good for him. He's been good for me too, I admitted. I wasn't looking for this. Whatever it is we're building. But I'm grateful for it. She studied me with kind eyes that reminded me of her son's. Loss shapes us in ways we can't predict. Sometimes it closes us off. Sometimes it opens us to new possibilities we might never have considered otherwise. She smiled. I'm glad you and Miles found each other, regardless of how it happened. That night, sharing the guest room that Elaine had matter-of-factly prepared for both of us, Miles and I crossed another threshold. What began as a simple goodnight kiss deepened into something more passionate, more urgent. We discovered each other slowly, with the care and attention of two people who had known loss and understood the preciousness of connection. Afterward, lying together in the quiet darkness, Miles traced patterns on my skin with gentle fingers. Okay, he asked softly. More than okay, I assured him, surprised by how natural it felt to be with him this way. How right. Just processing. Good processing or concerning processing. There was a hint of vulnerability in his voice. I turned to face him, wanting him to see the truth in my eyes. Good. Definitely good. Just new territory for me. His smile in the dim light was tender. For me too, in many ways. It's been a long time since I felt this way about anyone. We fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, a peace settling over me that I hadn't experienced since before Rebecca's illness. Not the same kind of love, that would never be replaced, but something equally valid, equally precious in its own right. Returning home after the holidays, our relationship settled into a new pattern. Miles began spending more nights at my house than at his own, gradually moving clothes and personal items into my space. We established routines together. Morning coffee on the porch when weather permitted, evening walks through the neighborhood. Weekends split between his passion for art exhibitions and my interest in historical sites. In late January, as we lay together in what had become our bed, Miles broached a subject we had been circling for weeks. I've been thinking, he began, his voice careful in the darkness. My lease is up for renewal next month. I waited, sensing there was more. It seems silly to maintain two households when I'm here most nights anyway, he continued. Financially impractical, at the very least. Are you proposing we move in together? I asked, a smile in my voice. I'm considering it, he replied, matching my tone. But I understand if it's too soon. Or if you're not ready to share this space permanently. It was your home with Rebecca for so many years. I thought about it, truly considered what it would mean to have Miles fully integrate into the home that had been my sanctuary of memories. To my surprise, the idea didn't feel like a betrayal or an erasure. Instead, it felt like an evolution. The house taking on new life, new memories alongside the old ones. I think Rebecca would approve, I said finally. She always hated waste, financial or emotional. And she would have liked you. Miles propped himself up on one elbow, studying my face in the faint light from the window. You think so? I know so. You both share the same fundamental quality, seeing people as they are, not as you wish them to be. I reached up to touch his face. I would like you to move in. If that's what you want. His kiss was answer enough. Spring arrived with a burst of new life in Rebecca's garden. Our garden now, as Miles had taken an active interest in maintaining and expanding it. We planted his Japanese maple in a spot where it would eventually provide dappled shade for a reading bench, a symbolic joining of our separate lives into something shared. One evening in April, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, Miles took my hand. "I've been thinking about the package," he said. "What package?" I asked, momentarily confused. "The one that was delivered to your house by mistake. The one that brought you to my door." He smiled, a hint of wonder in his expression. "If it hadn't been misdelivered, we might never have met. Or at least not like this. Not in a way that allowed for everything that's happened since." I considered this, the strange serendipity that had brought us together. A small mistake with significant consequences. "Very significant," he agreed, squeezing my hand. "I used to think losing Ryan was the worst thing that could happen to me. Now I see it differently. Not as an ending, but as a necessary transition to something else. Something I wouldn't have found otherwise." The sentiment echoed my own journey. How the devastating loss of Rebecca had eventually, improbably, led to this new chapter one could never have anticipated. Not a replacement for what had been lost, but a different kind of joy, equally valid and precious. "I'm grateful for that misdelivered package," I said softly, "and for everything that's followed." Miles leaned over and kissed me gently, a promise and an affirmation all at once. "So am I." Every single day, as twilight deepened around us, I reflected on the unpredictable nature of life's journeys. How a simple errand to deliver a neighbor's package had opened a door I didn't know existed, leading to a connection that had transformed both our lives. There was a lesson there, perhaps, about remaining open to possibility even in the midst of grief, about how healing can arrive in unexpected forms and from unexpected directions. Rebecca would have appreciated the poetry of it. The historian and the therapist, both experts in different aspects of human experience, finding common ground in shared loss and unexpected joy. Two stories of endings that had somehow twined together into a new beginning, as surprising and welcome as spring flowers emerging from winter earth. The package that had started it all still sat on a shelf in Miles's study, empty now, but preserved as a reminder of how the most mundane objects can sometimes be vessels of profound change. A cardboard box, addressed incorrectly, that had delivered something far more valuable than its contents. The possibility of renewal, of second chances, of love after loss. Sometimes, it seemed, the universe makes deliberate mistakes,